Grace Langford died quietly, just as she lived. No family, no headlines, just a name on a folded notice. But on the morning of her funeral, they started coming. Uniforms, medals, silent salutes. The morning Grace Langford died, the wind came in early. It carried the smell of dry leaves and faint wood smoke, brushing across the back porch of the little white house off Hollow Road like it knew, like it had always known. The kind of wind that rustles memory more than trees. Inside, the air was still. Grace's favorite gospel station hummed low on the radio. The kettle on the stove had long gone cold, and beside her chair, her reading chair, angled slightly toward the window, a folded quilt waited on the armrest like a question never asked. Her hands rested in her lap, calm, folded over a handwritten note sealed in an envelope marked, Pastor Elijah. Her silver watch, the one that hadn't worked since 1983, glinted softly on her wrist, frozen at 4:12. Beside her feet, Jasper stirred. The hound lifted his head, blinked once, then again. His ears flicked. His breath, slow and steady, quickened. He nudged her knee once, gentle, puzzled, then stood and padded to the front door. He didn't whine, didn't bark. He just sat there, waiting. Out on the dirt road, Haven Ridge had already started moving. A truck full of cotton scraps rolled past the church. Mrs. Dillard's porch light flickered out. Somewhere someone fired up a weed trimmer. And in that warm, golden quiet, the kind of quiet that only ever comes in late November in a town too stubborn to admit winter, Grace Langford was gone. Nobody noticed at first. Not because they didn't care, but because she had made it easy. That was always her way. Grace never needed much, never wanted the spotlight, never talked long when a nod would do. She made pies for the church bake sale, left homemade preserves on porches, swept the community center even when no one asked. Most folks in Haven Ridge would have described her the same way. A sweet, quiet woman who kept to herself. Kind. Proper. Lonely. Maybe. Just Grace. And so when she didn't show up at church that Sunday, no one worried. When her light didn't turn on that evening, most thought maybe she'd gone to visit her niece in Pulaski, like she used to. It wasn't until Tuesday afternoon, when the mailman noticed her basket of letters untouched and Jasper still pacing the porch, that someone knocked on the door. It was the pastor who found her. He didn't cry. He just sat for a long time in the wooden chair across from hers, his eyes fixed on her folded hands. He held the note a full hour before opening it, and when he did, he didn't read it aloud. He just whispered, "My Lord," and picked up the phone. The funeral was scheduled for Friday. Simple, quiet, just as she'd requested. No choir, no flowers, no fuss, just a wooden casket, a prayer, and "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" playing on an old cassette. They held the service at Haven Ridge Baptist, where the pews creaked like they were part of the congregation. Half the town came, mostly women from the church and a few older men, who remembered her tending the potluck tables. No one wore black. That wasn't Grace's style. It was only halfway through the eulogy that things began to shift. The first car pulled up just as the pastor was reading Psalm 23. A dark green sedan with an out-of-state plate, then another, then a battered pickup. A van, a bus. One by one, strangers entered the sanctuary. Some wore uniforms, old and tight across the chest. Others came in civilian clothes, but with something unmistakable in their bearing. The way they stood, the way they looked at Grace. Veterans, more than a dozen, then 20, then nearly 50. By the time the pastor reached the closing line, "And she shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever," there were more veterans than townspeople in the church. Some had come alone, some leaned on walkers, a few wore medals. One man in a wheelchair had a folded flag tucked in his lap. They sat in silence. Not one spoke. Not until they began to rise. One after another, they stepped forward and placed something at the foot of Grace's casket. A ribbon, a dog tag, a letter, a small wooden crucifix, a silver brooch shaped like an eagle. No words, no explanation, just offerings. The townspeople watched, stunned. One woman from the choir whispered, What in the world? The mayor stood in the back, arms folded, blinking hard. The pastor cleared his throat, stepped up again, and tried to offer some closing words. But before he could speak, a man in a navy jacket raised his hand. "I'd like to say something," he said, voice rough from age or smoke or memory. He walked to the front, placed both hands on the pulpit, and looked down at the casket. "I met Lieutenant Langford in 1971. Camp Evans, South Vietnam. I'd been shot through the leg. They dumped me on a cot in a tent full of screaming. I was sure I was dying." He paused. "And then she came. No words, just steady hands. She stopped the bleeding, made sure I kept my leg, and she sang to me. Quiet, like a hymn you only half remember." He smiled, eyes wet. "She never told us her story, but she saved half the camp." Others nodded. "She held my brother's hand when he died," said a woman in the second pew. "She taught me how to walk again," whispered a man with a cane. And then more voices, more names, more stories. She'd served in Korea, then Vietnam, decorated, twice, mentioned in dispatches, but she never said a word. Not when she came home, not when the town called her that nice old nurse, not when she swept the church floors or fed the dogs behind the market or folded napkins for the Thanksgiving table. She never needed them to know, because she already knew who she was, and so did they. The church emptied slowly. Jasper walked behind, the casket tail low, ears pinned back. He didn't whine, didn't bark, just followed, silent as ever. At the cemetery, the crowd had grown. More cars, more uniforms. Some of the younger folks from town had started Googling her name. The few records they found made them stare. "She was in Saigon," someone murmured. "She helped evac wounded during Tet." The truth unspooled like thread from a spool long forgotten in the back of a drawer. When the final prayer was said, the man in the navy jacket stepped forward once more. He placed his silver pin on the casket, a small, unadorned dove. "She never wanted medals," he said. "So, this one's for us." That night, Haven Ridge was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from realization. Something had been in their midst all along, something sacred, and they hadn't seen it. Not until the casket was closed. Not until the dog stood guard on the porch again, alone. Not until the lights in her little house on Hollow Road stayed dark for good. But Grace had already taught them what she came to teach. You don't have to be loud to be mighty. You don't have to speak to be heard. You just have to keep showing up even when no one thanks you, especially then, because love in silence still saves. By the time the war ended, Grace Langford had mastered the art of vanishing into a room. She knew how to move through corridors without echo, how to fold linen without a sound, how to cradle pain without breaking under it. Haven Ridge welcomed her home with polite nods and casserole dishes, praise wrapped in pity, then quickly forgotten. No one asked about the photographs she kept in a tin box. No one asked what she had seen or why she flinched when doors slammed. Grace didn't volunteer. Stories. She unpacked her bags in the back room of her childhood house, just 4 blocks from the old general store, and took up her post at the local clinic. Small, dimly lit, tucked beside the post office, the clinic became her second war front. There were no bombs, no screaming helicopters, no stretchers dragged through mud. But there was pain, and there were people who needed her. In the mornings, she cleaned bandages, organized prescriptions, and listened, really listened, when the veterans came in with phantom pains or wives too weary to carry the burden alone. She remembered their eyes. Sometimes she remembered their screams. Sometimes they remembered hers, but no one said a word. She walked home every night just after dusk, her shadow long in the amber street lamps, her leather bag slung over one shoulder. Children in the neighborhood called her Miss Langford and didn't know why they felt safe when she passed. The only ones who visited her porch regularly were the stray cats that curled under her rocking chair and a quiet mutt with one ear torn and a limp that never healed. He came one afternoon during a dry October. Thin, sun-warmed and covered in burrs, The dog had limped into her backyard and sat by the compost bin, like he'd lived there all his life. Grace had blinked at him from the kitchen window and then returned to her tea. The next morning, he was there again. By the third day, she left a dish out. She named him Jasper. He never barked, never chased cars. But wherever Grace went, from the clinic to the edge of the woods where she sometimes gathered herbs, he followed. He sat beside her when she read on the porch. He laid beside her bed when the nightmares shook her chest. He didn't need to know the war. Somehow, he understood it. Neighbors began to say she was kind, that she was strange, that she wore the same sun hat every Saturday to the farmer's market and bought twice the vegetables a single woman could eat. What they didn't know was that she cooked in bulk and packed the meals into foil trays, each labeled in careful script, and dropped them off at the old Baptist church parking lot before sunrise every Sunday. A homeless man named Eddie knew. A widow with dementia who lived behind the library knew. A teenage boy with bruises on his arms knew. But Grace never said a word. She didn't join the town meetings, didn't gossip, didn't complain when power lines fell or when mail arrived a day late. She planted basil in old coffee cans, kept her curtains half closed, and wrote long letters in a journal she never mailed. Every year, on the last Thursday of November, she laid a single place setting across from her at the kitchen table and served 2 portions of dinner. Jasper sat under the table as if waiting for someone else to enter. On Christmas morning, she hung one stocking and filled it with dried apples and a folded card that read, "You're not forgotten." She never explained who it was for. Maybe it was for the men who never came home. Maybe it was for herself. Haven Ridge moved on. The town built a new supermarket, repainted the gazebo in the square, and installed LED stoplights. Children grew. The old farmers passed on. But Grace remained, a fixture, a quiet one. A woman you nodded to but didn't ask too much about. Until one day, a young veteran named Travis came into the clinic. He was 25. Thin, pale, skin pulled too tight around his knuckles. He hadn't been back from overseas for more than 3 weeks, but his eyes already looked years older. Grace took his blood pressure, pressed her stethoscope to his chest, and said nothing. When she handed him a small bottle of pain relief, he asked, "How do you not hate the world?" She blinked. He said, "I know who you are. My grandfather talked about you." She tilted her head. "Lieutenant Langford," he said, his voice catching. "You sewed him back together in a jungle with no lights. You sang him a hymn while you tied his leg." Grace lowered her eyes. "He made it home. Because of you." She handed him the bottle and turned to tidy the counter. He didn't push, but he came back the next week, just to sit, just to talk. He brought other young men, some who didn't speak for months, some who shook when buses passed too fast. One cried when Grace handed him a cup of sweet tea. No one else in town knew. But in that small back room of the clinic, Grace Langford was still serving, still sewing, still stitching people together, one silence at a time. The old dog Jasper slowed. His fur turned silver like hers. He no longer rose when the screen door opened, just wagged his tail and blinked his amber eyes. Grace began writing letters again, this time to the families of those boys. Notes of encouragement, sometimes prayers, always unsigned. She declined invitations to banquets, to parades. She never stood in front of microphones. Her service record remained locked in a wooden chest at the foot of her bed, under a quilt stitched from army field scraps. Only once did she pull it out, when Travis brought his newborn daughter to visit. Grace, trembling, pinned a small bronze ribbon to the baby's blanket. "He would have been proud," she whispered. Travis didn't ask who he was. He only nodded and said, "So am I." In the final months, Grace stopped walking to town. Her bones ached. Her hands curled tighter at night. But she never let the porch grow dusty, and she never missed leaving food in the church lot. When she could no longer cook, she gave Travis the recipes. He didn't ask why they were written on the backs of old medic reports. He just made them faithfully. And one morning, when Jasper didn't wake, Grace sat beside him on the floor for hours. Her hands stayed on his side, warm, steady. She whispered every name she remembered from the war. When she buried him under the oak tree behind the house, she placed a red poppy over the fresh dirt and said, "You were my last soldier." And that night she wrote her last letter. "If anyone ever asks, tell them I was never brave. I just showed up. I just stayed. I just did what others couldn't see. But if that's what they call courage, then maybe I had a little." She signed it, simply Grace. By the time Grace Langford passed away, few in Haven Ridge knew she was gone. No ambulance came. No obituary ran in the local paper. It was just the neighbor, Mrs. Lila Townsend, who found her. The screen door creaked open when she knocked, and the wee smell of stale coffee and cedar floated out. She knew something wasn't right. Inside, Grace lay on her old floral couch, as if she'd simply drifted to sleep. There was no struggle, no mess, just silence, and a still warm mug on the side table. The dog Jasper sat at the foot of the couch. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just stayed there, head low, amber eyes watching everything, as if waiting for her to wake. They said the dog had waited 3 full days, didn't leave her side, not for food, not for water, just waited. And when Mrs. Townsend called animal control, the officer didn't have the heart to take him. He muttered something about leaving the dog with her just a little longer. "He looks like he's got more dignity than I do," the man said. "Let him keep his post." The town, of course, did the polite thing. The church offered a time slot on Saturday morning. A few women from the choir gathered dusty hymnals. Someone called the florist about a modest spray, white lilies and baby's breath. Mrs. Townsend signed the paperwork and made arrangements with the local funeral home. Closed casket, no need for expense, no known family, no eulogy planned. They put a folding table near the entrance with a notebook labeled Memories of Grace. But the first few pages stayed empty. A few wrote the same words. She was quiet, kind. I think she used to be a nurse. The pastor expected maybe 8 or 10 people, most of them older, most of them attending out of obligation, not affection. They knew Grace had lived there, but they hadn't known her. That Saturday morning, the autumn air hung heavy with dust and dry leaves. No frost on the windows, just fog and wood smoke. The church's old white steeple caught the first morning sun, and pigeons scattered as the doors creaked open. Mrs. Townsend arrived first. She wore a mauve dress with a sun-faded hem and brought a Tupperware of oatmeal. Cookies, though she wasn't sure anyone would eat. By 9 a.m., the sanctuary held maybe 7 people. One man coughed. Another checked his watch. The choir warmed up half-heartedly, flipping through sheet music for "It Is Well With My Soul." And then, the first man arrived. Not a local, not a familiar face. He wore a dark jacket, his left leg stiff, the way men walk after war, hair buzzed, hands weathered. His chest bore a small pin, 1 star, silver. He took a seat in the 4th pew. Didn't say a word. Then another came. A younger man. And another. A woman with a cane. A man with no arms. A man in full dress uniform, chest full of ribbons, back straight as a flagpole. They just kept coming. Filing in like ghosts returning to a town that had forgotten them. By 9:10, the sanctuary was full. By 9:15, the folding chairs were out. By 9:20, there were people standing along the walls, outside the doors, spilling down the steps. No one said how they found out. No one had sent an invitation, but the word had gone out. Quiet as a prayer. Lieutenant Langford is gone, and those she had carried once across blood-soaked fields, those she had stitched, sung to, sat beside while bombs fell. They came. The pastor stood at the pulpit, mouth slightly open. Then he closed his Bible, cleared his throat, and stepped aside. Because one of the men, tall, bald, with a thick neck and eyes like glass, rose slowly from the 3rd row. He took off his cap and held it against his chest. "My name's Carson," he said. "Grace, Latit Langford, patched me up outside Chosin in '51. I was 17, crying like a baby, thought my guts were falling out. He paused. She tied off the bleeding with her own scarf, told me I wasn't allowed to die because she didn't want to write the report. Laughter rippled, tears followed. Another man stood. She stayed with me when I couldn't sleep. Every time the sirens went off, she sang "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." I don't even believe in God, but when she sang it, I almost did. A woman stood next. She taught me how to bandage a chest wound with a tin plate and a rosary. Man followed her. She found me 3 days after I'd gone missing in the jungle. Everyone else thought I was dead. She didn't. The testimonies kept coming. Men in wheelchairs, women with trembling hands, people who hadn't spoken about those years in decades. Now standing for her. Not one of them knew each other, but all of them knew her. Not the quiet old lady who baked zucchini bread and fed stray cats, but the one who slept with a medical bag beside her cot, who gave her rationed chocolate to the dying, who once punched a captain in the face for trying to evacuate without the wounded. And slowly, the townspeople began to listen and see. Outside, the dog sat beside the fire. Doors, Jasper. He didn't move, didn't bark, just sat as if standing guard. Someone had put a bowl of water beside him. He hadn't touched it. A little girl reached out to pet him, and her mother gently pulled her hand back. "Not now," she whispered, because somehow, everyone knew he wasn't just a dog today. He was her dog. And this was his post. After the stories. One of the men approached the casket. He was older, maybe 80. Walked slowly with a cane, but his uniform was crisp, his boots polished. He pulled a box from his pocket. Inside was a single silver brooch, simple, elegant, tarnished. By time, he kissed it once and placed it gently on top of her coffin. Then he said, "You saved more lives than any general ever did. You never asked for thanks." And then he saluted. The pastor didn't give a sermon, the choir didn't sing. The wind moved through the open windows, and the church bells rang once, though no one had pulled the rope. After the crowd filtered out, Mrs. Townsend stayed behind. She picked up the notebook labeled "Memories of Grace," flipped past the blank pages. Then she opened to the back and wrote, "You fed the hungry, you held the broken. You never needed a headline, because your legacy was made of breath and heartbeat and mercy. Thank you, Grace Langford. We see you." Now, she closed the book and left it on the pew. That night, in the park where Grace had left food for the homeless, someone hammered a wooden post into the ground. On it was nailed a hand-painted sign, in memory of late Grace Langford. She never stopped showing up, and beside it, a bowl of food and a place to sit, in case someone needed both. For weeks after the funeral, people in Haven Ridge walked a little slower past the bench at Marigold Park. The sign remained, in memory of late Grace Langford. She never stopped showing up. Some said it was just wood and paint, but others couldn't help but pause beside it, sit for a moment, say nothing, as if the silence there felt different, fuller. Sometimes there was a flower in a jar, other times a thermos of coffee left beside the base of the post. Every so often an envelope, sealed but unaddressed, slipped beneath the bench like a whispered confession. But it wasn't the sign that changed Haven Ridge. It was what people learned after. In the weeks following her passing, Mrs. Lila Townsend took responsibility for clearing out Grace's house. The old clapboard bungalow on the edge of Cotton Hill Road didn't look like much. Sagging porch, faded shutters, a wind chime made of old spoons that hadn't sung in years. She entered with care, as if stepping into a church. Jasper padded softly. Beside her, nose low, tail still. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and dust. A quilt lay folded on the back of the couch. A stack of sewing patterns sat neatly beside a worn Bible. The kitchen was spotless, and in the back room, her bedroom, was the real heart of her life. A desk lined with envelopes, each addressed, each labeled, one for every month since 1972. Over 50 years of letters. Lila opened one gently, hands trembling. Inside was a short note, handwritten in slanted cursive. To the one still fighting, I don't know your name, but I remember your face. I remember the fever, the trembling, the night you whispered for your mother, and then apologized for crying. You made it out. That means something. I hope you know that you're more than what they told you. I hope you know. I prayed for you, still do, always, Grace. Dozens more like it, some filled pages. Others were only 2 or 3 lines, but each one was written to someone Grace remembered. People she had patched together in tents, in bunkers, on the backs of trucks. People the war had tried to unmake, and that she had helped hold together with trembling fingers and whispered lullabies. Then came the discovery that shook the town. In a drawer tucked into her hallway hutch were receipts, dozens of them. Receipts from food vendors, medical suppliers, a few checks written to the local community health clinic, one for an oxygen tank, another for winter coats. She'd been donating, quietly, monthly, never under her name, sometimes listed simply as Anonymous Angel. Over the years, she'd paid for heating oil, dental cleanings, children's textbooks, even a new roof for a single mother's trailer after a storm ripped it open. None of the recipients ever knew who'd helped them. But now, the ledger had a name. The church held a second memorial. Not in the sanctuary this time, but out in the field, behind the town center near the old community garden. It wasn't planned, just began. Someone showed up with a folding chair. Someone else brought muffins. Then people came to speak. Not of battlefield memories, but of the small human moments. A boy, now grown, stood and said, "She taught me how to spell my name." I was 6. My mom cleaned her porch and Grace would give me a cookie if I read her a new word. A woman came next. She used to sew patches on my son's jeans, wouldn't take a dime. Said, "Stitches cost less than shame, honey." One after another, the stories came. About how she left baked bread wrapped in tea towels on porches. How she carried a first aid kit in her purse even to church. How she once sat in the waiting room with a woman she didn't know while her husband had surgery, just because no one should sit in silence alone. It was during this time that something shifted in Haven Ridge. People began showing up for each other, not in grand gestures but in grace-sized ones. A neighbor started leaving sandwiches in the same park she used to visit. Kids in the local high school painted the bench at Marigold Park and added a tiny bronze plaque shaped like a nurse's cap. At the post office, someone started stamping every outgoing letter with a small sticker that said, "Still showing up." And the phrase stuck. It became a kind of quiet anthem, a whispered vow, and then came the final legacy, the lawyer's call. No one expected Grace to have a will, let alone anything to leave behind. But she did. What she left behind wasn't money, it was land. 6 acres behind her home, overgrown, forgotten, but registered in her name and now donated to the town for any use that serves those in need. The town voted unanimously to build a small shelter, not a large, sterile building, but a quiet, beautiful space. A garden with benches, a single-room aid station for the unhoused or elderly, a shaded porch with rocking chairs and warm lights. They named it Langford Hollow. At the entrance stands a wooden arch, carved into it. She never stopped showing up. The final ceremony took place 1 month after the shelter opened. It was Thanksgiving morning. The air was cool but dry. The trees had shed most of their leaves, leaving behind an amber glow on the ground and a sky streaked with soft orange light. Small crowd gathered. Veterans, neighbors, strangers. Children held hands with grandparents, and Jasper, now gray at the snout, slower in his gait, lay at the foot of the dedication plaque, amber eyes still watchful. There were no speeches, no fanfare, just one man, Carson, stepping forward with a wreath. He laid it beneath the sign, saluted, and said simply, "Still standing, ma'am, just like you taught us." That night, Lila Townsend found herself alone in Grace's old home. The town had agreed to preserve it as part of the Heritage Trail. She'd come to lock up, but she lingered, sat on the edge of the bed, and whispered, "They see you now, Grace, not just as a nurse, not just as a helper, but as something bigger. You were the sermon no one preached, the hymn that never needed music, and the strength behind all our quiet victories. She closed her eyes. Outside, a breeze stirred the spoon chimes, and for just a moment, it sounded like someone humming. Thanks for spending time with us today. If this story meant something to you, pass it on. This is Still Standing Souls. Real stories, quiet strength, lasting hope.